My name is Jill Garner and I'm Victoria's Government Architect, and I have the privilege of representing the voice of design within government in an effort to help government be the best client that they possibly can. You know, government's a really big client of architecture, and if they are an intelligent client and a good client, they'll demand excellence from those that give it to them. So having somebody who understands the conventions of design and what good design looks like sitting within government is of great assistance to those that don't understand the conventions of design, or who are maybe economists or lawyers or political persuasion. So it's quite a strange and quite perhaps a different kind of expertise for government in a way, to sit there in that with that hat on. But what we're finding, interestingly, is we find incredible champions for design in government. And because we're building for the community, we realise that the better we design, the better legacy we build for our community, the happier our community is. So that's my job. I'm also a practicing architect, not that I practice terribly much at the moment. I'm 4 days a week in government, and I'm told, my partner tells me I interfere in practice 1 day a week. But what's really great about maintaining that engagement with practice is maintaining the realities of practice. You know, a lot of the people that were interviewed talked about the practicalities and the everyday challenges and the constraints that one has to design with. And they're really important things to know. The construction industry is full of difficulties that you need to navigate. So being in the construction industry, as well as being in the role of critic or the role of advocate, advisor, really helps me to keep a finger on the pulse of what's going on in industry as well. I've obviously been in practice for a very long time. I've also taught at both Melbourne University and RMIT in architectural design, theory and history. So I do have a good engagement with the universities over many years as well. So what I'm going to do is to look at all 7 of the presentations and just briefly touch on perhaps the key themes and the key ideas that I gathered out of each of the interviews, because they were each in their own way extremely interesting and insightful, but they also shared quite a lot of common ground, which was very interesting. So I'll start with Adam, who is obviously an architect by training and has stepped out of the idea of being an architect. So he sort of stepped outside of perhaps sitting behind the design to becoming a maker. And I think what was interesting about Adam's narrative is how disenchanted he clearly became at some stage with where he sat in an architectural position, where he was disenchanted by the idea of architecture being a service industry. And he sort of felt that his ideas, or the idea of conceptual kind of representation, could never override the problems of functionality. I got the sense that he got overwhelmed by the ordinariness, if you like, of architecture. The constraints on it are really difficult. And so his distance that he found himself from the feedback loop, the loop of creating, making, failing, redefining your project, and then trying to make it better, he felt removed from that as an architect. And I think stepping into the world of furniture design allowed him to be so hands-on about that, and that hands-on connection between the mind and the imagined item and then the physical item was obviously extremely important to him. So he's obviously finding far more satisfaction in being close to the product, because as an architect, you're not always close to the outcome. You sometimes feel that your input is a long, long way from being a maker. In my observations of where Adam was coming from was his understanding and his perception of scale and design for a particular place I thought was interesting, and very much associated with the idea of context in architecture. So he talked about his furniture being very place specific. So if it was going into a tiny apartment, he would make sure it was very thin and refined and light, so that it actually worked with the space that it was put in and it didn't overwhelm it. So that idea of the lightness of detail to work with the scale of the space is a very, very important understanding of a relationship between space, scale, detail, those sorts of things. Very exactly what you do in architecture if you are at the coalface, which he clearly used to get frustrated by not getting to the coalface. The other thing I thought was a very interesting theme, which was recurring across everybody's commentary, is that acknowledgement of history and the knowledge of your own craft through history. You know, who do you admire? Who are the people who sit in your folio of interesting producers from the past or interesting creators from the past? The idea that what you produce is a complex assembly of a whole lot of influences. And it's as much valuable in that concept of being a furniture designer as it is in architecture. And I think that idea of assembling complex input is a recurring theme right across everybody's discussion. Moving on to Ian McDougall from ARM. Ian suggests that he approaches architecture as a political act, which is very different. It's not just a personal pursuit. It's a way to challenge tropes or challenge the politics or the general conventions of the day. He likes the idea of promoting design as a challenge. So his response to your question about parti, or the driving idea behind what he's doing, is maybe more about the process of architecture as having the capacity to carry a narrative. That narrative helps him design his piece. So his starting point is always embedded in the context, not just the context of the place, but the context of the project itself. So he talked about how if he's designing a theatre, he'll look so closely at the context of a theatre, of a context of performance. He will look at how you might bring that experience to those who are visiting the new building. So he sees that process of design as quite mysterious. And this is very common discussion in architecture, that no one really sees that sort of quiet or that desperate deliberation that exists behind the scenes as you're trying to get it right. And that's what he means by the mystery that nobody ever sees, the battle to get it okay. So he suggests there's no defined ambition that he's heading towards, but it becomes a journey that includes reference, research, knowledge of ambitions that are relevant to the particular project at hand, which is why he talked about a different approach, a different outcome for various projects, which are so particularly tied to the project type or the architectural type or the building type that he is producing. You know, a theatre is not the same as a library, is not the same as a civic centre. So that kind of decision about how to get to the right outcome for the particular nature is an interesting one. And he talks about how occupation and experience gives rise to the form of the building. So he never tries to squeeze a program into a preconceived idea. One gives rise to the other. Once again, we see this idea of the challenge in how to address a particular context, but context for Ian extends beyond the place to the actual program and the context, maybe the political context. He's very, very strident on the need for architects to understand history. And what his advice to students is to know history, to know it so well that you understand how you can use it to deviate from it. If you don't understand history, you can't challenge it. If you don't understand architecture from the past, you can't produce the architecture of the future. He's so enthusiastic about how architecture can reflect how loud and emphatic contemporary life is. And I think that's interesting too. And you can very much see that in ARM's buildings. They're loud and they're emphatic. And he talks about that as being quite representative of the type of life that we all occupy these days. The other thing I loved, and he was the only person in this series of interviews who used the word joy. There is something about the experience of architecture that if you give joy to those who go there, you know, you give them a smile, they find something really special about the place that you have given them. I think that's a very, very important concept that sometimes we forget. So ARM again, Howard, which was interesting, a slightly different point of view to Ian's, and perhaps less about things being legible to the observer. In fact, Howard went so far as to say he didn't believe that you could read architecture, that the person who experiences it is very unlikely to find legibility in it. So he kind of doesn't subscribe to that idea of thinking that you can perhaps give people a particular experience. He has quite a different attitude towards that and suggests that architecture is not legible to the observer, and that perhaps we're all labouring under an incredible misapprehension if we think we can influence that. But he talked about seeing design as a way to explore the human condition. And he was quite emphatic about architecture. It's not about lifestyle. It's not about an object. It's not a discussion, and it's not a discourse. It's actually a way to explore the human condition. He talks about seeing design as a search for something, and the idea that we don't ever invent anything. We see this in the others' references to history, that we know history and we might reinterpret or we might reinvent. Howard was very emphatic about this, and in fact, he talked about Australia as sitting on the fringe of a particular architectural world, and the fact that we adapt, we change, stretch, reform, reinvent. And he suggested that we've always done that here in Australia because we've never been part of a particular architectural history that we all learn. He suggests that's not real to us. What's real to us is the reinvention of that history in a stretched, a reformed, a reinvented, a changed way. I think that's quite an intriguing concept. The other very important thing that Howard raised, and I think everyone needs to think about this, is how can we move beyond the limits of our own imagination? And if we're restrained and restricted by what we know, how can we ever do something original or do something different? And I think that's a constant challenge for designers, and move beyond the constraints of what they already have experienced. So Sonia from Red and Black, I think was quite a down-to-earth approach in comparison to who we've listened to. She articulated your questions about parti in a rational way to see this as the outcome of a series of processes. So a series of processes that she as an architect runs through that ends in the visual representation of an idea. So all of those influences, judgments, all of those functional decisions, the challenges, the constraints, finds itself in the end in the visual representation of an idea. So it's a series of processes that you find a thread through them and you finally get to the outcome. But I think one of the very important messages from Sonia is that she reminded us of the need to not be seduced by our own ideas or particularly by our own drawings, that as you're trying to get to an outcome and you rather fancy what you're drawing, don't get seduced by it, because you've got to be prepared to discard it and change it or rework it. And in many ways, they're the same kind of words or concepts that we've heard even in Howard's work, that idea of changing, reinventing, stretching. They're things you have to be prepared to do because your original concept is not going to be right. And so how do you get to a point that's better than where you started? And the only way you can do it is by being prepared to let go of your ideas when they don't work. So she talked about how the image and the idea that the drawing can be terribly dangerous. It's quite a powerful thing, a powerful tool, but also potentially quite a dangerous tool because we fall in love with our own drawing and we do have to be careful not to do that. She supported the idea of writing can also support the image. So obviously that's something that they do in their practice. They talk about their approach to what they've done. But she also talked quite clearly about trying to dump archi-speak. We sometimes suffer from the idea that we have some secret language that we all understand, but in reality, our clients need to understand it. We need to forge these relationships with our clients. And in fact, she talked about making our clients champions of our own projects, that at some stage we hand our work over to them and it becomes theirs. We need to prepare them to take on board our own narratives and they become their narratives, because what we do is we hand our project over to our client. And so if they become a great champion for your ideas, you can't get much better than that, really. I guess my observations is her encouragement of the negotiation between the client and the architect. It was a very strong theme. And that idea of transferring the ownership of the design from you as the hand that invented it to the client who becomes the owner of it. Dugdale from Central Australia. Like Sonia, I think Sue articulated quite a rational approach to some of your questions, and she also similarly expressed the need to trust the process of design to resolve very difficult and contrary sometimes uncertainties in a project, whether those uncertainties are functional things, budget things, construction challenges. So she talked about those various uncertainties in a project needing organisation, and she saw the process of architecture as an organising process of finding your way through all of those uncertainties, and in the end you get to a visual representation of the idea that has had awareness the whole way of all of those difficulties associated with the idea. So she reminds us of the practicalities in architecture, and she reminds us that we need to synthesize and embed and filter all of those real issues, the real parameters that we're designing with, which includes form, function of the building, it includes constructability, it might include sustainability, and things even like the budget. They're really critical parts of the architect basket of tools that have to sometimes, unfortunately, be embedded in the project and be navigated through to get to that outcome. The other thing that Sue, as an architect who has practiced for a very long time, she's a very experienced architect, and her discussion of the concept of developing judgment, I thought was a great discussion. And the idea that in maturity, the more you do, the more you design, the more you resolve these difficulties of a project, the better your judgment becomes. And you get better at understanding when you get to a good design. And a little perhaps reflecting some of that observations made by Sonia, that you have to be prepared to dump something when it's not working, but that innate judgment that you need to develop to know when you've actually got to a position that's quite good. And it might not be perfect, but if it meets the parameters of what you're heading towards, it possibly becomes right. And so you need that maturity of judgment to allow you to develop to a point where you can judge your own work as having achieved something that's okay. Otherwise, you could keep going forever, because there's never one answer in design. There's hundreds of different answers, but you yourself, through your own lens and your own parameters, have to judge when you have achieved something that you think is pretty good in response to all of the difficulties. So once again, like Sonia, she encouraged that what might be called a circular check-in between the designer and the client, that regular going back, checking, have I got it right? Am I answering your brief? And that idea that the client gets buy-in of your outcome. Her overarching concept, I suppose, is design as a gathering and a synthesis of so many disparate things, that you've got a lot of balls. Well, she called them sheep. Lots of sheep in your paddock. How do you gather them together? How do you make sure you don't lose any of those particular pieces that need to be embedded in the design and get to a holistic outcome? So now we get to Kim and Aaron from Edition. And again, they talked about the distillation of the incredibly varied and sometimes difficult issues associated with design. They talked about how you synthesize social issues, cultural issues, contextual issues, and they discussed how all of those things also need to be overlaid by what might be called architectural concerns or design concerns, which are about form and about space and about materials. So you've got those various concerns that need to be distilled into an outcome. And again, they stressed the context of the project. They stressed the fact that any project is dealing with a place, it's dealing with people, and it's dealing potentially with politics as well. So that need to understand the context, distill the context, and embed that response to context in the outcome. They also talked about options, a little like Sue, saying how do you know when you've got to something that's good, and then how do you know when you get to something that's better than when you thought you had got to it previously. And they talked about that layering of design and sketching and kind of going through optioneering. And they said, you know, it's probably not a good idea to do 100, you'll just confuse yourself, but to work over the top of where you are and to have options so that you can critically say, does that solve my problem? No, it doesn't. I'm going to move on to my next one. So that concept of design as exploration was very important here. And you find conviction. At some point, you get conviction about the fact that you've reached a point that this is okay, and this is the one, or this is the concept I'm going to take forward. They also talked, which I think was an interesting thing, how you form your own principles that allows you to judge your own work. And that's what helps you to get to the point where you can judge the principles. You know, how do I know that I haven't solved this yet? And if you have your own series of critical principles against which you look at your work, you'll know if you haven't solved daylight, you know, if you're interested in sunshine or daylight or views, if you look at your outcome and you kind of haven't nailed it, you haven't nailed a relationship between inside and outside or something like that, you know you haven't got there yet. So if you've got a personal set of architectural principles that you like to bring to a project, gives you almost a checklist that you can make sure you haven't forgotten something that you think is important. So they talked about those personal principles, personal project principles. I think they're very important in judgment. And then they talked also about communication and how to communicate your ideas. And they talked about the various means of communication, which we've heard about from others too: writing, drawing, words, sketches, the computer, being competent in all those things so that you can support your work through various messages and various mediums. And I think probably what's important to remember in that message is clients all read things differently too. You know, some clients cannot understand drawing and would like to hear what you're doing in words. Some can't read plans, some can read plans. Many can't understand space, so they might need a model. So I think that concept of learning what you need to communicate your particular project to the skill or how, you know, the type of process that will impact that particular client with that particular project, it's very important that you are adaptable to that too, because our clients' capacity and capability change as well. Other observations I'd make about their discussion, it was the issue of collaboration, because obviously Edition has done quite a lot of collaborative projects. And I think what some of the commentary on that was very pertinent and very important, because what they suggested is that collaboration allows you to realise that your collaborative partner might take you to a place that you would never have got to on your own. And so to be convicted about your own design, but not so convicted that you can't allow it to move in some way that might end up at a better place. And so their enthusiasm for the way that collaboration takes you to somewhere better, I thought was a very good message that they put on their discussion there. They also reminded us all designers, all architects need to be people who look, who observe, and who experience. So if you're not engaged in the world, you can't design for the world, because you can't sit in a room and think you can create spaces for people if you're not part of that. And so they were very strident really about encouraging those that do design for people to occupy the places that people also occupy. So everything is understood from first principles. They also used, perhaps it's a different word to Ian. Ian used the word joy. Aaron and Kim used the word excitement. And they suggested that one needs to find something exciting. You do need to love what you do. So you have to find something that gives you passion in your design. Then Mark Healey from 6 Degrees. He, interestingly, much like, I guess I thought this was interesting because he was the first person to say the word parti is sort of a word that he never used when he was being educated as an architect. I admit it's one I never used either. We all seem to vaguely understand what it is, but Mark suggested it's potentially a word that is used a lot more now than it used to be. And I guess what he made the assumption that what we mean by parti is the idea behind the project, you know. And certainly he talked about the fact that, yes, most projects need a big idea, maybe an idea, but he did say that from his point of view, there is rarely a big idea. And others commented on this too, that instead of it being about one big overarching concept, it's actually a gathering of various very complex and diverse ideas. And what you find is an organizing principle that allows all of those diverse ideas to turn itself into something that's spatial and occupiable and something that gives you an experience. So like Ian, really, he used the concept of the user experience as something that dictated the form of the architectural outcome. And he suggested how the form of his architecture would be influenced by the user experience. So thinking through every space and every experience that someone who visits his building would go through will dictate the form of the building. I'm not sure if that's quite true, but I think what's interesting about it is that it means that he's not starting with that idea of squeezing everything into a box. He's allowing each space to offer a particular experience to the user of the building. He once, like others who suggested that the tips for young architects or young graduates or those who are students, tips are learning to draw, learning, stepping away from the medium of just the computer screen, learning how to hold a pencil, learning how to understand space, learning how to communicate in various ways. And he talked at length about the concept of learning to read and draw a plan. And he talked about how the focus really of his understanding of space and his understanding of form is embedded in solving the plan. And the beauty of the plan becomes a beautiful building, because if you can really see that in 3 dimensions, you know exactly what you're putting together. So he talked also about the capacity to visualize, not visualize through a computer, but visualize personally. He talked about being able to sit down and close your eyes and visualize the space that you are trying to produce for your client. And then he talked about how to, learning the skills to get that visualized space down on paper, so it becomes a drawn visualization of the space that you're talking about. So he saw it really as really important that you learn to draw and to learn how to interpret within your own mind, and how to link those two things, for vision to your hand, and then get it onto a site as well. So all of those things were very important in his commentary. So he also suggested that need for years and years of learning to get competent. And I liked how he was honest enough to say when he started, his first few years of architecture, he was frightened by how little he knew, and he thought he could leap to an outcome that was really good. I'll be able to do this. And he likened it to learning how to play a musical instrument, and how bad you are when you start, and how many years of experience and how much practice you need to, in fact, get to being competent. I thought it was a really good comparator, because I think we don't understand that apprenticeship and that those years of learning that really allow us to understand space and to understand form and to understand relationships. And the other thing that was important from Mark's message too is that idea of engaging with others in our profession in a really positive way, and that idea of getting positive critique and offering positive critique from your peers, that peer review, but learning how to do it in a way that is really helpful and constructive, because none of us benefit from being torn to pieces. But what we do benefit from is people identifying the way we might approach something better. And possibly, I equate that quite often with the idea of, and I mentioned the word conviction before, that idea of being convicted about what you're doing, but holding on to your convictions quite lightly. And if someone has a very good reason to say, you haven't quite got that right, you need to be prepared to loosen your grip a bit, let it go, and be influenced and listen and say, actually, yes, in fact, my doorway, well, I'll hit my head when I walk through the doorway. Just because you've drawn it doesn't mean it's right. So that idea that others might help you get to a better outcome. So in a positive kind of way. So that idea of constructive criticism was embedded in Mark's discussion as well, which clearly is part of the basis of their practice too, that idea that they all contribute to the outcome. So there's an overarching kind of observation on each presentation.